I never thought it would come to this, standing next to my old motorcycle while Camille loaded up someone else's gear into our SUV. My name's Liam. I'm 46 years old, and I've spent most of my life in Denver working as an engineering consultant. That morning, I thought we were heading out together for a 2-week tour of the Southwest National Parks. I'd spent months getting everything ready, our routes, the camping permits, the stops along the way. I had it all mapped out. Camille was the one who first brought up the trip. "Let's see the country the way it's meant to be seen," she'd said. So I spent late nights poring over maps, researching hidden canyons, little diners tucked away in desert towns. I wanted it to be perfect. 14 years of marriage deserved something more than a typical vacation. At least, I thought so. But now, standing there on the driveway, Camille's expression was stone cold. She was next to Troy, her yoga instructor, of all people. He looked like a poster boy for those outdoor gear ads. Blonde hair, expensive hiking boots, a smug look on his face. He didn't say a word. He just kept his hand on her shoulder, like he had some right to it. "I'm still taking the trip," Liam, Camille said, her voice so calm it made my chest hurt. "Just not with you." She didn't flinch when she said it. Just looked me dead in the eye, like she was telling me she'd ordered the wrong coffee or something. She reached for the hand-drawn map I had spent weeks on, our trip, our adventure, and slipped it into her backpack like it was just another thing to pack. The thing that really stung? She didn't even ask if I minded. I didn't say anything. I wanted to scream, to tell her she was out of her mind, to ask if she was seriously leaving me here. But I didn't. My jaw clenched so tight it hurt. I just watched them like I was watching a stranger take something I'd built with my own 2 hands. Troy didn't even look at me. He just smirked like he was in on some private joke. Camille turned away from me and climbed into the SUV, buckling in like she was heading off on a family vacation. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the driver's window, hair a little messy from the wind, oil stains on my jeans from the bike. I looked like a ghost. The man she used to love was nowhere in that reflection. When she rolled the window down, she looked at me like she was about to apologize. But she didn't. She just said, "I hope you understand, Liam." Then she smiled, the same fake, polite smile she'd been using more and more lately. And then they drove off. I stood there, the morning air biting a little at my neck. My heart was pounding, but I didn't move. I just watched the SUV turn the corner and disappear. I thought about all the work I'd put into this trip. The calls to my company's logistics guy to make sure every reservation was secured. The digital ID protections on every single campsite and lodge. She thought she could just walk away with it like it was hers. But she didn't know that every part of this trip was tied to me, my work, my name. She could take the map, but she didn't have the keys to the whole thing. When they were gone, I turned back to the bike. I ran my hand over the leather seat, feeling the warmth of the sun on the metal. I'd spent months rebuilding it, piece by piece, night after night, until it was just how I wanted it. Funny how something made of metal and grease felt more real to me than the woman who'd just left. I swung my leg over the seat and fired it up. The engine rumbled under me, steady and sure. I wasn't sure where I was going to go now, but I knew this much. I wasn't going to let them take this trip from me. It was mine, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was ready to take it. Alone, maybe, but it would be real, and it would be mine. Back home, the silence was deafening. I parked the bike in the garage, letting the engine's warmth fade as I stepped into the house. The same house Camille and I had poured so much of ourselves into. Weekends spent stripping old paint, hours choosing the right shade of tile for the kitchen backsplash. I paused in the doorway, feeling the ghost of those memories pressing in on me. I sat down in the living room, where the walls were still covered with photos of places we'd been. The Grand Canyon, Lake Powell, that trip up to Yellowstone when we got caught in a thunderstorm and ended up laughing so hard we couldn't breathe. I remember thinking that was the kind of memory you hold on to, something to get you through the days when things didn't feel quite right. But lately, those days have been adding up. I thought back to the first time I met Camille. It was at one of those architecture tours downtown. She was wearing this bright red scarf that kept slipping off her shoulder, and she had this way of talking about old buildings like they were living things. I remember being struck by how much she cared about the details, how every arch and window had a story. She made me see things differently. Back then, she was still working in interior design. She wanted to move into heritage restoration, she said, and I wanted to help her get there. I pulled some strings with friends in the business and even helped her get her first few contracts. I was proud of her. I wanted her to feel like she could build something that was truly hers. For years, we were partners in everything. Every trip we took, every late-night talk about what the future might look like, it was all about building something together. Or at least, that's what I thought. Somewhere along the way, things shifted. She started talking more about what other people were doing, what they were wearing, where they were vacationing, how they styled their homes. She'd come home from those social nights with friends, eyes glittering, telling me about some new trend in modern design or some couple who had just put in a zero-edge pool. I went along with it. Bought the expensive faucet she wanted for the bathroom remodel. Picked up an overpriced light fixture because she said it would pull the whole room together. At first, I told myself it was just part of growing, keeping up, maybe. But I think deep down, I knew I was losing her to something I couldn't compete with. The idea of what our life should look like started to matter more to her than the life itself. I remember one night, about a year ago. She came home late from some networking event. She looked so happy, so lit up in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. When I asked how it went, she barely looked at me. She was too busy scrolling through her phone, checking messages. That was the night I realized she wasn't coming home to me anymore. She was coming back to a life she had to maintain, a performance she had to keep up. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun lazily. In the quiet, I could almost hear her voice, the way it used to be, excited about things like chip paint and old floorboards, things that had character. But somewhere along the way, that voice got lost. And I let it happen. I kept trying to fit myself into the life she wanted, telling myself that's what love was, adjusting, making space, staying steady. But I realized now that I was just making myself smaller. I walked through the house, running my hand along the old pine table we'd refinished together. Every scratch and dent had a story, our stories. But looking at it now, it felt like the past was something she'd decided she didn't need anymore. I stood in the doorway of what used to be her office. All those design books lined up neatly on the shelves, the desk where she'd sit for hours sketching out ideas. It was still hers, even though she was gone. The truth is, I'd seen this coming long before she walked out with Troy. I saw it in the way she stopped listening to my stories about work, in the way she'd roll her eyes when I talked about the motorcycle, or how she'd sigh when I'd suggest a weekend camping trip instead of another dinner party. I wanted to believe it was just a phase, something we'd worked through. But deep down, I knew. She wasn't looking at me like a partner anymore. I was just part of the furniture, something she'd grown tired of. I sat down at the kitchen table, resting my hands on the wormwood. I thought about how much of myself I'd poured into this life with her. How many times I'd told myself that if I just tried a little harder, she'd see me again. But now, in the quiet, I could finally admit it. She hadn't been seeing me for a long time. And maybe I hadn't been seeing myself either. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes. The weight of it all settled over me, but there was something else too, something lighter. For the first time, I wasn't trying to make her happy. I wasn't trying to measure up to some version of life that didn't fit me. I was just sitting here, in the house I'd helped build, and I felt, still, like maybe I was finally done trying to be something I wasn't. And maybe that was enough for now. I woke up early the next morning. The sun was just starting to creep through the blinds, and for a moment, everything was still. I lay there staring at the ceiling, the quiet so thick it felt like it was pressing down on my chest. I knew I couldn't stay in that house another day, not with all those reminders of her in every corner. So I got up, showered, and packed a small bag. I didn't take much, just what I needed for the trip I'd always planned to take. I left the rest behind, like shedding old skin. I paused at the door to her office one last time, the map she took gone from the wall. That was fine. She could have the lines on the paper, but not the path itself. I sat down at my computer and pulled up the travel bookings. One by one, I canceled everything tied to her name. It felt like closing the door on a part of my life that had been dying for years. My company's logistics contractor had set up everything under my secure credentials, rental cars, campsite reservations, even the fuel cards for the trip. I knew she thought she'd walked away with it all, but she hadn't counted on that. She'd never really paid attention to how it all worked. I rerouted my flight to Santa Fe instead of Phoenix. It was a small shift, but it felt like taking back the trip piece by piece. Then I canceled the fancy lodge she'd wanted for the first night, some overpriced place with copper bathtubs and a chef who probably sprinkled gold flakes on the food. I didn't care. Let her and Troy figure it out. As I worked through the cancellations, I called my cousin Beth. She picked up on the second ring, her voice groggy but warm. "Liam? What's up? It's not even 7. "Hey, Beth," I said, my voice low. "You still up for that hiking trip you mentioned a while back? I'm headed to the Southwest and thought it might be good to have some company." Beth paused for a second. "Yeah, I'm in. You sure about this? After everything?" I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "I'm sure. I need to get out of here. And I figured you'd understand. More than you know, she said. She told me she'd meet me in Santa Fe in a couple days. I could almost hear the relief in her voice. She'd been dealing with her own mess, a husband who'd decided the grass was greener with someone else. We both needed this trip, even if it wasn't the one we'd planned. I closed my laptop and looked around the house one last time. It didn't feel like mine anymore. It was just a place I'd been living in, trying to convince myself that if I just kept fixing the pipes and painting the walls, everything would be okay. But it wasn't okay, and it was time to go. I locked the front door and walked out to the garage. The bike was waiting, the metal still warm from the ride the day before. I strapped my bag to the back and fired up the engine. The rumble of it felt good in my chest, steady and sure, like it was reminding me that I still had choices, that I could still move forward. As I pulled out of the driveway, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew that house wasn't my home anymore. My home was the road ahead, the places I hadn't seen yet, and the parts of myself I'd stopped paying attention to. I took the back roads out of Denver, winding through the foothills. The air smelled like pine and warm asphalt, and for the first time in months, I let myself breathe. No more second-guessing, no more trying to fit into someone else's life. Just me, the bike, and the open road. When I stopped for gas just outside of Colorado Springs, I checked my phone. There were no messages from Camille, no last-ditch attempts to make me come back. I wasn't sure if that made it easier or harder, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to be the one to fix her mess anymore. I had my own life to figure out. I rode until the sun started to set, the sky turning gold and pink over the mountains. I found a cheap motel off the highway and checked in under my name only. No shared accounts, no joint plans. Just me. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed with a beer in my hand, the glow of the motel sign flickering through the window. I felt something shift in me, a quiet resolve I hadn't felt in years. I knew I was done trying to hold on to something that was already gone. This trip was mine now. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. 2 days later, I was standing in the parking lot of a little taqueria in Taos, eating tamales with Beth. She'd driven down in her beat-up Subaru, that old thing with the cracked windshield and the camping stickers on the back. We'd been laughing about how neither of us had seen the inside of a yoga studio in years, and how maybe the only thing we really needed from this trip was a break from everything. The sky was so clear it hurt my eyes, that bright blue you only get out here. I felt lighter than I had in months, like the pieces of me that had been buried under all the years with Camille were finally coming up for air. Beth raised her beer in a half-toast. To second chances, she said, clinking the bottle against mine. That's the thing, I said, taking a sip. I don't even know if I want a second chance. I think I just want to figure out who I was before all this. She nodded. That's fair. And you deserve it. My phone buzzed just then, rattling on the edge of the picnic table. I picked it up and saw Camille's name flashing on the screen. I hesitated for a moment, my thumb hovering over the button. Beth arched an eyebrow at me, but I just shook my head and answered. Hello, I said, keeping my voice steady. Liam, Camille said, her voice a mix of panic and that cold control she'd always used when things didn't go her way. We have a problem. I'm sure you do, I said, leaning back in my chair. What is it? The lodge in Zion, she said quickly. They're saying they can't find the reservation. Troy tried to charm the staff, but they're not budging. The car's GPS isn't working either. We're stuck out here, Liam. I could almost see her, standing in the middle of that fancy lobby in her hiking gear that probably hadn't seen a real trail in years, Troy trying to talk his way out of it with that smug smile. You're stuck because you thought you could just take what wasn't yours, I said calmly. Liam, come on, she snapped. This isn't funny. We've got no place to stay, and the car's fuel card isn't working. Can you fix this, please? I took a bite of my tamale, letting the heat of the chili settle on my tongue. I'm in Taos, I said. Beth and I are having lunch. I'm not fixing anything for you. Liam, don't be like this, she said, her voice cracking a little. We're in the middle of nowhere. You can't just leave me here. I felt a small smile tug at the corner of my mouth. I didn't leave you anywhere, Camille. You left yourself. I'm not responsible for that. There was a pause on the other end, and I could hear Troy in the background, his voice low and urgent. We need to figure this out, he was saying. Camille's voice came back, smaller now, almost pleading. Please, Liam. I know I messed up, but you can't just leave us stranded. I leaned forward, my voice soft but firm. I'm not your safety net anymore, Camille. This was your choice. You wanted to take the trip without me? Then figure it out without me. She let out a shaky breath. You're being cruel. No, I said, shaking my head. I'm just done. I hung up without another word. The silence afterward was almost as loud as her voice had been, but it felt clean, like fresh air after a storm. Beth reached over and squeezed my hand, her eyes kind but steady. You okay? She asked. Yeah, I said, exhaling slowly. I think I am. We sat there in the sun, the noise of the little town around us, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Camille could keep her illusions of control. I wasn't part of them anymore. I took another bite of my tamale and looked out over the low adobe buildings and the bright sky. She'll figure it out, I said finally. Beth just nodded. Yeah, she said. She will. Or she won't. Either way, it's not on you anymore. And just like that, it felt like the trip had really begun. Beth and I found a secluded campsite later that evening, just a few miles off the Rio Grande Gorge. We set up our tents on a patch of red dirt overlooking the canyon. The air was cool and dry, and the only sounds were the whisper of the river far below and the occasional crackle from our small campfire. We sat on folding chairs with cold beers in hand, watching the sun slip behind the canyon walls. I felt the kind of tired that settles in your bones after a long day on the road. But it was the good kind of tired, honest, earned, not the weary ache of trying to hold together a life that didn't fit anymore. Beth poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks into the dark. So, she said finally, breaking the silence. You seemed almost prepared for all this. I let out a small laugh, taking a sip of my beer. I guess I was. I'd been seeing the signs for a while. The half-truths, the late nights, the way she always seemed so busy with everyone else but me. She nodded slowly. You know, when I found out about Jared and his affair, I felt so stupid. Like I'd been blind to it all. But the truth was, I saw it coming too. I just didn't want to admit it. I watched the flames dance in the fire, the way the shadows played across her face. I kept telling myself it would pass, I said. That if I just did more, made the trips perfect, kept the house just how she liked it, she'd see me again. But I was just making myself smaller and smaller, trying to fit into this version of life she wanted. Beth was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at me and said, You can't fix a partner who's fallen in love with the idea of someone else. I nodded slowly. Yeah, I said. That's exactly it. I leaned back in my chair and took a deep breath. The night air was sharp and clean, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush. The thing is, she wasn't in love with Troy, I said finally, the words feeling heavy in my mouth. She was in love with escaping me. Beth tilted her head, studying me. What do you mean? I shrugged. I was always the steady one, the safe one. She got bored of me long before she met him. Troy's just the excuse she needed to break away. Beth nodded, her eyes sad but understanding. Yeah, she said. I think that's how it usually goes. The person they run to is just the easiest way to leave the life they're tired of. I watched the fire burn down to embers, feeling the weight of it all settle on my shoulders and then lift, just a little. I kept blaming myself, I admitted quietly. Thinking if I'd been more exciting, more adventurous, she would have stayed. Beth reached over and squeezed my knee. You can't keep trying to be someone else just to hold on to someone who's already gone, she said gently. You're not the reason she was empty. That was hers to fix. I felt something break open in my chest then, like a knot that had been there for years. You're right, I said, my voice low. For the first time, I'm starting to believe it. We sat there for a long time after that, watching the stars come out one by one. I told her stories about how Camille and I had met, the long drives we used to take just to see how far we could get before we had to turn back. Beth shared stories of her own. Her first backpacking trip in the Rockies, the day she realized her marriage was more about keeping up appearances than real connection. It felt good to talk about it. Not to wallow in the pain, but to put it in the air and let it lose some of its power. By the time the fire had burned down to glowing coals, I felt lighter. Like maybe this was the beginning of something new, not just the end of something old. Beth stood up and stretched, her breath visible in the cold night air. You want another beer? She asked. I smiled, feeling the warmth of the fire and the quiet peace of being out here, away from everything that had held me back. Yeah, I said. I think I do. She disappeared into her tent to grab the cooler, and I leaned back in my chair, staring up at the endless sky. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for someone else to decide my next move. It was my life, my trip, my choice. And that was enough. We woke early the next morning, the cold biting enough to remind us we weren't in Denver anymore. Beth was already heating water for coffee on the camp stove when I crawled out of my tent, the world around us still and quiet in that early light. She looked over at me and smiled. "Sleep okay?" "Better than I have in weeks," I said honestly. And it was true. There was something about the sound of the wind and the low hum of the river below that settled me in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. After we ate, we packed up and hit the trail. The hike through Bryce Canyon was like something out of another world, towering red spires and dusty switchbacks that wound down into the earth. I let Beth take the lead, her easy confidence in the backcountry exactly the kind of presence I needed. Every so often, she'd glance back to make sure I was still with her, and every time I'd just nod, feeling more like myself with every mile we walked. We didn't talk much at first. The crunch of gravel under our boots and the low call of birds overhead said enough. I found myself thinking about how long I'd been holding my breath in my own life, trying so hard to be the kind of man Camille wanted that I forgot to be the kind of man I wanted to be. Out there, under the wide sky, it was easier to see how small her expectations had made me feel. We stopped at a lookout point, the whole canyon spreading out below us in a blaze of orange and red. I pulled out my phone and saw a new message from Camille. I didn't even read it. I just pressed delete, my thumb steady on the screen. It wasn't anger anymore. It wasn't even disappointment. It was just done. Like turning the last page of a book you know you'll never read again. Beth watched me with a kind of quiet understanding. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, tucking the phone back in my pocket. "I'm more than okay." She smiled and nudged my shoulder. "Good. You deserve to be." As we hiked deeper into the canyon, I started to open up to her about the things I hadn't said out loud in years. How much of myself I'd buried under that steady husband role, trying to hold everything together. How I'd convinced myself it was noble, not realizing I was just making myself invisible. Beth listened, really listened, in that way only someone who's been through their own unraveling can. She shared pieces of her story too, how she'd spent years trying to fix her marriage with Jared, even when she knew it was beyond repair. "We're so good at ignoring the cracks," she said, "until one day we can't anymore." I didn't want to see them, I admitted. I thought if I could just keep us moving forward, everything else would fall back into place. Beth laughed softly. "Yeah, I know that feeling. But it's not on you to hold up the whole world." We sat for a while on a sun-warmed rock, passing a thermos of coffee between us. I pulled out a small journal I'd tucked into my pack, something I hadn't touched in years. I flipped to a blank page and started sketching the canyon, the lines rough and quick. I wrote down a few lines of a poem that came to me as I watched the way the light shifted over the rocks. "I am not what I lost. I am what I carried through." I didn't know if it was any good, but it felt like mine. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. Beth glanced over my shoulder, her eyes soft. "That's beautiful, Liam," she said. "You should keep going with it." "I think I will," I said quietly, and I meant it. We stayed there until the sun started to dip lower in the sky, the shadows stretching out across the canyon floor. When we finally packed up and started back down the trail, I felt lighter than I had in years. Like every step was taking me further away from who I thought I had to be, and closer to who I really was. As we reached the trailhead, I looked back one last time at the winding path behind us. The air smelled like dust and pine, and the world felt big and open in a way I hadn't let myself feel in a long time. I knew there was still a lot ahead of me. Hard conversations, legal paperwork, maybe even some heartbreak still to come. But for the first time, it didn't scare me. Because I wasn't living in the shadows of someone else's expectations anymore. I was walking my own trail now. And that was more than enough. Back in Denver, I didn't waste any time. I went straight to the office of the attorney I'd worked with for years, Nancy Holt. She'd helped me draw up the paperwork when I first started consulting, back when I thought the only contracts I'd ever need were for work. But that morning, I sat across from her in her glass-walled office, the city sprawling out behind her like a promise and a warning. "So," she said, flipping open a yellow legal pad. "You're ready to move forward." "I am," I said. My voice sounded calm, but inside I felt like I was finally breathing for the first time in weeks. "I want to file for divorce. Misuse of marital assets, emotional abandonment. The whole 9 yards." She nodded, scribbling notes as she went. "We can make that happen. You've already done most of the legwork, with the trip cancellations and locking down the accounts. That will help." I thought about that for a second. About how I'd spent so much of the past year watching Camille slip further away, and how I'd finally decided that I wasn't going to let her take the best parts of my life with her. I'm not going to let her drain me dry, I said quietly. She can have her new life with Troy. She just can't have mine. Nancy leaned back in her chair, studying me. You've been smart about this, Liam. Most people in your position get caught up in the emotion and forget to protect themselves. But you've been one step ahead. I learned that the hard way, I said, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. I left her office an hour later, the first round of filings already in motion. Outside, the June sun was bright and hot, but it felt good on my face. I wasn't hiding anymore. I was reclaiming the pieces of myself I'd let her take. Next, I called my accountant, Cal. He was a friend of mine from way back, someone who'd always told me the truth, even when I didn't want to hear it. He met me for lunch at a little diner near my office, a place we used to go when we were both younger and thought we'd have everything figured out by now. I took a look at the joint accounts, Cal said, stirring cream into his coffee. She's been siphoning off money for months, Liam. $38,000 gone, all tied to that affair and her social spending, as she called it. You want me to keep digging? I nodded. Yeah, I want it all documented. Every dollar. He gave me a look, half sympathy, half admiration. You're not the same guy I met 15 years ago, you know that? Yeah, I said, my mouth tightening into a smile. I think that's the point. After lunch, I drove back to the house. It felt different now. Not like the place where we build a life, but like a project I was about to wrap up and leave behind. I changed the locks and forwarded the mail, making sure nothing of hers would come back to haunt me. In the guest house, the one Camille had always insisted was just for storage, I started clearing out space for a rental unit. It felt good to think about new beginnings, even if they were small ones. I was finishing up with the new deadbolt when my phone buzzed again. Another message from Camille. I didn't even bother reading it. I just swiped it away mid-preview. She'd made her choice, and I was finally making mine. As I walked back to the main house, the warm breeze rustling the leaves in the yard, I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. It wasn't just about the divorce, or the money, or the betrayal. It was about knowing I wasn't going to be part of someone else's story anymore. I was writing my own, one line at a time. The papers were filed. The accounts were locked. The life she'd tried to steal was mine again. And for the first time in a long time, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. It was a week later when Camille called again. I was in the workshop out back, setting up shelves and measuring lumber for a small project I'd been putting off for years. The phone buzzed in my pocket, and when I saw her name, I didn't feel a thing. No anger, no curiosity, just a dull indifference that settled deep in my chest. I let it ring twice, then answered. Hello. Liam, she said, her voice tight and trembling. I need you to listen to me. I leaned back against the workbench, wiping sawdust off my hands. Go ahead. She took a breath. I'm at a spa in Palm Springs. They won't let me stay. The card got declined, and they're threatening to call security. I waited, and her voice cracked. Troy's gone, Liam. He left this morning. He said it wasn't supposed to get serious. He's not even answering my calls. I didn't say anything. I could hear the desperation in her voice, the panic that came when the fantasy finally fell apart. She was alone now, and she wanted me to fix it for her. Liam, she said, her tone shifting from desperation to accusation. You can't just leave me like this. I gave you the best years of my life. My youth. My energy. You owe me. I almost laughed, but it came out as a slow breath instead. I gave you my stability, Camille, I said, my voice calm. You gave it away. She was silent for a moment, like she was trying to find a new angle, a new way to convince me to play the part she needed. This isn't fair, Liam. You're acting like none of it mattered. Like I'm nothing. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of those years settle over me and then slip away like water through my fingers. I'm not acting like it didn't matter, I said. I'm just done pretending it still does. Her breathing hitched, and then her voice dropped to a whisper. What happens now? I opened my eyes and looked around the workshop. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching the floating dust and golden beams. The papers are filed, I said softly. The funds are audited. My life is no longer yours, Camille. You're making a mistake, she said, her voice turning sharp again. You'll regret this. No, I said simply. I won't. She was silent then. I could hear her breathing, ragged and uneven, and for a moment I wondered if she was crying. But I didn't care enough to find out. Goodbye, Camille, I said. Take care of yourself. And then I hung up. I put the phone down and looked around the workshop. The wood, the tools, the quiet order of it all, it felt like mine in a way that nothing else had for years. Camille's voice was gone, and for the first time, it didn't echo in my head. It was just another chapter closed, another story I didn't need to keep reading. I picked up the measuring tape and went back to marking the board I'd been working on, the smooth scrape of pencil on wood as steady as my heartbeat. She could chase her illusions of control all she wanted. I was done being part of them. I was free. The family home sold faster than I expected. I didn't feel much when I signed the final papers, just relief. A clean break. One more piece of the past I didn't have to drag around anymore. I moved into a smaller place outside Durango, a modern little cabin with big windows that looked out on the mountains. It was quiet, just the way I wanted it. No fancy decor. No carefully curated image. Just good, honest wood and light and air. I spent the first few days setting up the workshop in the garage, stacking lumber and organizing tools like it was my own personal ritual. It felt good to build something with my hands again. Something no one could take away from me. In the evenings, I sat on the back deck with a beer, watching the sun set over the ridgeline. The sky would turn every shade of red and purple, and I'd just sit there, letting the quiet sink in. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to be anywhere else. Beth came by a couple weeks later, pulling up in her Subaru with a grin on her face. "Got someone I want you to meet," she said, popping the trunk and pulling out a cooler of tamales and beer. With her was Eric, an outdoor educator she'd started seeing. He was a quiet guy, the kind who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I liked him immediately. "Beth says you're leading weekend hikes for veterans," he said as we sat down around the fire pit I'd built in the backyard. "That's pretty great." "Yeah," I said, poking at the embers with a stick. "A bunch of engineers and former military guys who've been grinding themselves down for years. They needed something to remind them how to breathe again." Eric nodded. "Sounds like you're doing that for yourself, too." I smiled. "Yeah, I guess I am." We swapped stories late into the night, about places we'd been, trails we still wanted to hike, the ways life had surprised us. Beth watched me, her eyes soft. I think she could see how much lighter I'd become, how I wasn't just patching holes in a broken life anymore. I was building something new, from the ground up. A couple nights later, I got another message from Camille. Just a single line. "Are you really happy?" I stared at it for a long moment, the way the words felt like they were trying to claw back into my life. But there was no anger this time, no sadness. Just nothing. I deleted it without a second thought. I was done letting her steal my peace. The next morning, I woke early and went for a hike by myself. Just me and the red dirt trails, the whisper of the wind through the pines. At the summit, I stopped and took a deep breath, feeling the burn in my legs and the quiet rush of something that felt a lot like gratitude. I knew I wasn't starting over with a blank slate. The scars were there, and they always would be. But for the first time, I didn't mind. They were part of the story I was writing for myself, proof that I'd survived, that I'd learned, that I'd grown. Back at the cabin, I started sketching ideas for a side project, eco-friendly trail shelters, small and sturdy, something that could stand up to the elements. I wanted to build something that would last, something that could give other people the same quiet shelter I'd finally found for myself. I was living a smaller life, maybe, but it was mine, and that was more than enough. A few months later, I found myself back at the Grand Canyon overlook. It was early morning when I parked the bike and started walking the familiar rim, the same spot Camille and I had visited years ago but never really explored. The air was cool and sharp, the kind of air that makes you feel awake in a way coffee never could. This time, I was alone. I had my pack slung over one shoulder, a small camping stove tucked inside, and enough food to last a couple nights. I didn't need much. The point wasn't to fill the days with plans, but to just be here, to see what this place had to say to me without anyone else's voice in my ear. I set up camp on a quiet ledge, far enough from the main trails that I could pretend the whole canyon was mine. The world spread out in front of me in layers of red and gold and soft, ancient silence. I cooked dinner over the fire, nothing fancy, just a can of chili and a hunk of bread. But it tasted like freedom. After I ate, I pulled out the small leather journal I'd been carrying around. I flipped back through the pages, sketches of Bryce Canyon, rough poems I'd written late at night when the words wouldn't leave me alone. Each page felt like a little anchor, something I could hold on to when the past threatened to drag me under. I took a deep breath and started to write a letter. To myself. The kind of letter I wish someone else would have written for me years ago. "You are not what you lost," I wrote. "You are what you carried through." I let the words sink in. I thought about everything I'd survived, Camille's betrayal, the slow suffocation of a marriage that had turned into an act, the way I'd let myself shrink to fit inside her carefully curated world. And I thought about the moments of grace that had carried me through, Beth's steady friendship, the quiet hikes, the nights around a campfire where I finally felt like myself again. As the sky turned from orange to deep blue, I closed the journal and leaned back on my hands, staring up at the stars. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel broken. I just felt here. And that was enough. I watched the moon rise over the canyon rim, the way it turned the rocks silver and the shadows into soft pools of dark. I thought about how long it had taken me to get to this place, how many times I'd told myself to hold on just a little longer, and how, in the end, letting go was what finally set me free. In the early hours before dawn, I wrote one last line in the journal. Still here. Still climbing. When the sun finally broke over the edge of the canyon, I stood up and stretched, the weight of the pack settling comfortably on my shoulders. I took one last look at the view, a quiet promise to myself that I'd keep coming back. Not because I needed to prove anything to anyone else, but because I wanted to remind myself that I could. I walked back to the bike, the cold air filling my lungs and the sky turning gold behind me. And as I fired up the engine and felt the rumble of it in my bones, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I wasn't running from anything. I was just moving forward,